In this video, I'll give you a detailed breakdown of every single boss in the Manaforge Omega raid on normal and heroic difficulties. A lot of work has gone into this video, so if you guys could like and subscribe, that'd be greatly appreciated, but let's crack on with the first boss. However, before you enter the raid, you'll first need to acquire the Reshi Rap's legendary cloak, as it is essential to surviving multiple fights, but we'll cover that individually for each boss. The first boss in this raid, Plexus Sentinel, is a single target 2-phase encounter, and you'll want to Bloodlust on pull for this fight. In the first phase, tanks will want to keep the boss positioned in the middle of the room, and healers will need to keep on top of the incoming damage from powered automation. This frequently blasts out a chain lightning that arcs it up to 5 nearby players, so players should spread out at the start of the encounter to reduce the number of arcs, but as the fight progresses with area denial, the damage from this ability will ramp up. Multiple players will then be targeted with manifest matrices. This inflicts a nasty 6-second dot, so these players should pop a defensive while they run to the sides of the room, and this is because upon expiration it will create a displacement matrix that deals huge damage and stuns anyone that touches it, as well as also teleporting them to a random location in the room. So make sure to place these out of harm's way and avoid them, because triggering these traps will also create mana residue at their location. These pull slow players by 50% while dealing lethal arcane damage every 2 seconds, making it even more essential the matrices are dropped on the sides of the encounter and left alone. Occasionally, the boss will hit the tank with an Obliteration Arcano Cannon after a long cast. Tanks will need to mitigate this massive arcane damage while also running to the edge of the encounter before it finishes to drop the massive mana residue pool that it leaves upon impact. It is very important to run to the edge with this tank buster, as it also deals huge raid-wide damage based on how close you are to the rest of your team, so try to get as far away as possible, but non-tank players should also be responsible for keeping that distance. Tanks will need to taunt swap after each cannon, as it leaves a 1000% damage increase from the cannon for 45 seconds. On heroic, Arcane Lightning will also constantly rain down swirlies that all players must dodge at all times, and more notably on heroic, the Sentinel will mark a player with Eradicating Salvo. This fires 2 missiles in quick succession at the targeted player that both need to be soaked. However, the first missile will knock all players out that get hit, making them unable to soak the second missile. This means that you need to divide your raid into 2 groups, so you have at least 5 people soaking each missile to prevent any deaths. The second group should simply wait for the first missile to land before entering the soak circle. Do be careful when getting knocked back though, as you do not want to trigger a matrix, but also the arcane walls that close off portions of this encounter will instantly kill you if you come into contact with them, so stay mindful of this at all times. These arcane walls become even more relevant when the boss reaches 100 energy and casts Protocol Purge. Here, the boss will place a massive absorb shield on himself, push your raid back, and then teleport up the platform behind the next arcane wall. Use movement speed buffs here so you don't get pushed into the arcane wall behind you, and then the whole raid needs to chase after the boss to damage through the absorb shield. As you run up the platform, you'll need to stay on your toes as you dodge the rotating beams and traps, before using your legendary Reshi Raps to shoot you through the approaching arcane wall that will instantly kill anyone it touches. The Raps make you invulnerable while active, and it is the only way to pass this wall in one piece. Once you reach the boss, you then need to break through the massive absorb shield that constantly ticks arcane damage to all players, increasing in strength by 25% each time it casts. So use offensive and defensive cooldowns to break the shield to return to phase 1, especially on future protocol purges, as he will again push you all the way back to the start of the room while he teleports behind the next wall, making it harder to close the distance and therefore break the shield. Loom'ithar is the second boss in this raid, and it's a 2-phase fight. You'll want to save Bloodlust for the second phase, as the boss takes increased damage here. Throughout phase 1, the boss will cast Lair Weaving, summoning a collapsing ring of webs that are connected by infused tangle adds. One of these adds needs to be focused down so that your raid can pass through the ring safely, and on heroic, the tangles will be immune until they are hit with the tank frontal piercing strand. This is also a taunt swap, as it increases the damage taken from the next piercing strand by 500% for 10 seconds. The boss will also cast Infusion Tether, linking random players to the boss, dealing arcane damage over time and pulling them in slowly. If tethered, run to the edge of the boss arena to break the strands, and breaking them will drop a patch of Living Silk. Try to stack these pulls together, and be aware of the fact that if a player is standing in the Living Silk when breaking a strand on heroic difficulty, they will be encased in a silken snare, stunning them for 5 seconds. At 100 energy, the boss will cast Over Infusion Burst. This cast begins with an 8-second channel, dealing a decent amount of arcane damage every 0.5 seconds, and at the end of the cast, the energy is released, dealing fatal arcane damage to anyone caught. Be sure to run to the edge of the arena and use defensives to help your healers deal with the ticking damage. Throughout phase 1, the boss will also rain down swirlies of arcane energy with Primal Spellstorm. These swirlies deal a lot of damage, so make sure to move out from them. Healers should also be aware that the boss constantly pulses arcane damage with arcane overflow, so just make sure to keep people healthy. At 50% health, the boss will cast Unbound Rage, ripping itself free from its binding and becoming mobile. Here the boss takes 33% increased damage during this phase, so this is where you want to pop Bloodlust and pump as much damage as possible due to the soft enrage mechanic Arcane Ichor. Ichor pours from Loom'ithar's wounds, which leaves a growing puddle of arcane energy on the floor beneath the boss, so you want to move the boss slowly around the arena to save space. All players should be aware of their positioning for Arcane Outrage, as the boss will unleash waves of arcane energy that deal large raid-wide damage and knocks players back, so try not to be positioned too close to any living silk piles that you dropped earlier, or any of the pools of Arcane Ichor. The main mechanic for this phase is Writhing Wave. This is a large frontal on the current tank that players need to soak. On heroic difficulty, players will get a debuff taking 350% increased damage from the next wave, so you'll want to split the raid into 2 groups and alternate soaks. After the wave goes out, the other tank just needs to simply taunt and continue moving around the arena. Arcane Overflow and Primal Spellstorm will continue to cast throughout this phase, so just avoid the swirlies, use defensives and healing cooldowns where necessary, and burn the boss before she fills the room. Soulbinder Naazindhri is the third boss of this raid. This is primarily an ad management fight involving lots of cleave, and you'll want to Bloodlust on pull for this boss. At the start of the fight, the boss will activate chambers throughout the room with soul calling, transforming unbound souls in each chamber to join the Shadow Guard. The ads within these chambers are protected as long as the chamber shield holds. However, throughout the fight, players will be targeted with Soulfray Annihilation, which will place a line on the ground and fire an orb in that direction after a short duration. Players need to stand behind an incubation chamber to break this shield with the orb, in turn freeing the ads so that the raid can cleave them down. Be sure that players move away from these lines, as if the orb comes into contact with the player, the orb will detonate and you'll get overrun by ads later in the fight. When freed by the orbs, these mobs will take 200% increased damage, so burn them down as quickly as you can so you don't have to deal with their mechanics as often. There are 3 different types of ads in these cages and each behave differently, so let's go over those now. Shadow Guard mages cast Void Burst, hitting a random player with a burst of void energy which deals decent upfront damage and leaves a nasty dot for 20 seconds. These ads need to be interrupted, so make sure that you take your kick for this fight. Shadow Guard Phase Blades will sear a target, inflicting shadow damage which jumps between all players, so press defensives to help your healers with this unavoidable damage. Finally, Shadow Guard Assassins will target a random player, vanish into the shadows and then reappear behind them to deliver a massive amount of shadow damage. This also leaves a shadow dot, so this player will likely want to commit a defensive. You can choose what ads you want to break out based on how your raid deals with them. However, I would recommend breaking out as many mages and phase blades as possible, as it will make your life much harder when all of the ads are released if you have lots of kicks and phase blades to deal with. After 3 rotations of Soulfray Annihilation, all remaining ads in cages will become active. This will deal raid-wide arcane damage for every ad remaining with Essence Implosion. This is another reason why it's important to break out the ads gradually, as if you have too many still caged for this cast, you will most likely wipe. During this phase, group the ads on the boss and burn them down as quickly as possible. You'll have to do this ad rotation a few times as you whittle down the boss's HP, but there are a few other mechanics that happen throughout the fight that you need to be aware of. Tanks should be ready to taunt swap on Mystic Lash, as this tank buster brands the active tank, increasing the damage of the next lash by 12%. This effect stacks, so you'll want to taunt after each cast. Tanks will also need to move the boss around the arena to each chamber, depending on which ads your raid decides to free. And note that the same ads spawn in the same chambers, so you can plan this ahead of time. Healers should be aware of the boss's spell burn ability, which radiates arcane damage every 2 seconds, which just simply needs to be healed through. All players, however, should be aware of the arcane expulsion. This will unleash a devastating shockwave, dealing decent upfront damage, which also leaves a dot. More importantly though, this shockwave knocks all players back, so be sure to position away from the edge of the arena, as you will fall to your death. And please do not underestimate how far this knocks you back. And finally, throughout the fight, the boss will cause arcane energy through the bodies of several players with Soulfire Convergence. These targeted players will suffer arcane damage over 5 seconds, and upon expiration this dot will explode, firing orbs in all directions from the target's body. These orbs inflict a lot of damage and slow players caught by 45% for 15 seconds, so make sure to avoid these. Players targeted with this dot should move out of the raid to make it much easier for other players to dodge these orbs. Forgeweaver Araz is the 4th boss of this raid. This is a predominantly single target fight, however there are ads that need to be focused down. You'll want to hold Bloodlust for phase 2 of this fight. The main mechanic in phase 1 is Arcane Obliteration. This will target the current tank with a large circle that needs to be soaked by half the raid, and this will also spawn an ad that needs to be burned down as quickly as possible. For Heroic, you'll need to split the raid into 2 groups to alternate the soak, and the tank will also need to move the soak and the ad at least 20 yards away from the boss, as when they're near each other they take reduced damage and also deal tons more damage. Players that soak will be branded with Astral Mark, preventing them from soaking the next ad, which means that tanks will need to taunt swap after this debuff, swapping who tanks the ad and who tanks the boss. Throughout this phase, the boss will also use Invoke Collector to summon 3 pylons around the room, which are important later. When they spawn, they'll radiate out arcane circles that need to be dodged as they deal massive damage, but these pylons will also take unavoidable arcane damage to the raid with Arcane Siphon. The boss will also target 3 players, connecting them to a collector. After a few seconds, targeted players will spawn an ad that will float towards these collectors, and if the ad reaches its destination, it will deal massive raid-wide damage, so these players that are targeted with purple circles should move onto the boss so that the raid can clear the ads down quickly and also crowd control them to prevent them from moving. However, do not confuse this with the Silencing Tempest arrows, as you'll want players targeted by this to move away from the boss, as they will drop pools of arcane energy over 6 seconds, which also silences any player standing in them for 6 seconds. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will cast Arcane Explosion, dealing a decent amount of raid-wide damage, which also knocks players back. He is also immune to damage during this phase, so this is when you need to swap to the collectors around the room. Players need to burn down these collectors, as when they reach 100 energy, they will cast Arcane Convergence, which deals massive raid-wide damage that will most likely result in a wipe. However, there are shielded attendants that also spawn during this phase, which will soak this Arcane Convergence, so tanks will want to position these ads near the collectors as they get close to 100 energy. Tanks will need to juggle these ads with taunt swaps as they gain a stacking attack speed buff when attacking the same target, so swap when stacks are getting high. When all collectors are killed, the boss will then enter a burn phase taking double damage, so you can bloodlust this phase because of the increased damage. Just note that it only lasts 12 seconds, so it is probably safer to bloodlust in phase 2. At 30% health, the boss will cast Dark Singularity, knocking all players back and opening a deadly Shadow Rift on the far side of the boss arena. This black hole will constantly pull all players in, and the pull will grow in intensity until the boss is defeated, which is why you might want to hold Bloodlust for this phase. All players should move to the entrance of the arena and burn down the boss as fast as possible, and similar to the mechanics we saw earlier, the Dark Singularity will draw energy from several players, summoning an ad that will deal massive damage if it reaches the void. If targeted, players should stack on the boss so that the ads can be cleared down quickly and also crowd controlled. Silencing Tempest will still be cast on random players here, so if you get an arrow on you, be sure to move away from the raid to prevent people taking damage and also being silenced. The Soul Hunters are the 5th boss inside this raid. This is a 3-target council type fight with 1 main phase and 3 different intermissions, 1 for each of the bosses, and you'll want to bloodlust and pull for this fight. At the start of the fight, tanks will need to pick up Valerian and Alyssa, and make sure to keep Valerian faced away from the raid at all times. Tanks will also constantly need to reposition on top of Adara's Darkblades who cannot be tanked, as all of these bosses must die at the same time to prevent them pulsing out increasing raid-wide damage that will eventually wipe you. At the start of this fight, Adaras will spawn 2 Devourer's Ire circles that must be soaked by a singular player. The player soaking will then receive a Devourer's Ire debuff that causes Adaras to frequently attack them with Consume, dealing high cosmic damage and absorbing a large amount of healing. And on Heroic, this player will also suffer a debuff which constantly increases the damage taken from Consume, as well as increasing the healing absorb, so healers will need to spot heal these targets even more and eventually dispel this debuff before it kills the player, causing it to jump to the nearest player. These debuff players are very important for Adaras' next mechanic that we'll cover in a second. After afflicting 2 players with this debuff, Adaras will then constantly dash around the arena with Void Step, dealing lethal cosmic damage to anyone that stands in his way, so make sure to sidestep these circles. During his Void Step, he will also mark multiple zones with a Hungering Slash. This deals fatal damage to anyone within 8 yards of the impact, but also creates a pool of encroaching oblivion at the location. These zones will deal heavy ticking damage to any players inside the zone, as well as increasing their damage taken by 30%, and these pools will continuously grow over time. So, after these pools are spawned, the players marked with Devourer's Ire need to constantly stand inside these void pools to consume them before they eventually cover the whole arena and cause the wipe. These players should pop a defensive while soaking the encroaching oblivion, and once damage gets too high, especially on Heroic, healers should dispel the player and the newly debuffed player will need to go and clear more void zones. When you reach Adarus' intermission, he will jump to the center of the room and begin channeling Collapsing Star. During this channel, the boss will pull all players into his location, and at the same time he will pull the stellar fragments that are spawned outside of the arena. Players must intercept these orbs before they reach Adarus to prevent high raid-wide damage going out, but upon interception, these orbs will deal big damage to the player soaking, so be careful not to kill yourself by soaking too many. On Heroic, these orbs will also apply a nasty stacking 5-second dark residue dot when soaked, so be even more careful with how many you soak and pop a defensive. The reason that Valera needs to be faced away from the raid at all times is due to her I-beam. She will unleash massive chaos damage in the direction of the current active tank that also applies a stacking Fell Singe debuff to anyone struck. This increases damage taken by future I-beams by up to 80% for 40 seconds. During this beam, the tank will also be blasted away from her, ready for her to close the distance with a follow-up Fellblade. Here, Valerian will charge the active tank, dealing huge fire damage and applying a nasty 25-second fire dart. Tanks will need to use mitigation for both attacks here, and then tank swap after being charged with Fellblade. Outside of this, Valerian will target a random player with the Hunt, charging up a frontal beam towards them that needs to be soaked by many players to avoid the target being one-shot. On Heroic, players soaking will need to be super careful of their positioning, as she also inflicts additional damage in a 3-yard circle around every player inside the beam, so make sure you spread out along the beam to avoid stacking circles and one-shotting each other. Your raid leader may even want to limit how many people soak each beam to make dodging easier. When you reach Valarian's intermission, she will again jump to the center of the arena and start channeling Fell Rush. Here the boss will constantly target multiple players with beams that deal significant damage to anyone caught, so the targeted players should for the most part plant their feet while the rest of the raid moves away from them. Alyssa is the other boss that needs to be actively tanked. She will fracture the current tank, dealing tremendous physical damage and splitting off 2 fractured clones of the tank around the arena. While these souls are active, the tank's healing received is reduced by 33% for each active soul, so non-tank players will need to run over these souls to soak them, in turn inflicting the soaker with a 30-second dot that stacks, meaning they cannot soak the next fractured soul. Tanks will need to use defensives for this mechanic, and after being fractured, you'll want to taunt swap to avoid being one-shot by the next fracture. After casting Fracture, she will then cast Spirit Bomb. This deals large raid-wide damage as well as applying an 8-second dot and healing absorb to your whole raid, so healers should be ready to out-heal this absorb and damage over time, so you may want to commit a healing cooldown here. This Spirit Bomb will also detonate any remaining fractured souls, so they need to be soaked before this bomb goes off, or you'll likely wipe to the expulsed soul explosion. When you reach Alyssa's intermission, she will begin jumping around the arena with Infernal Strike, which one-shots anyone caught. She will then immediately follow this with a massive frontal Fell Devastation that all players need to run out from. On Heroic, if you are caught, you will also receive a stacking movement speed reduction that very quickly stacks up, so try to position yourself near where she is landing with her Infernal Strike to make dodging easier. After dealing with all 3 boss intermissions, there will then be a soft Enrage where you will have to deal with all of the boss's intermissions at once. You will eventually end up wiping to the chaos here, so try to DPS these bosses down before you see this final intermission, but if you do see it, you could opt to kill off one of the bosses to deal with the ramping AoE damage instead of a 3rd intermission mechanic. Fractillus is the 6th boss inside this raid. This is a single target DPS raid and you'll want to Bloodlust on pull for this fight. As you start the encounter, you'll notice 6 Nether Prism crystals spread across the arena that point towards the boss. These crystals mark out the center of 6 different lanes that will eventually fill up with Crystal Nexus walls that amplify the power of these Nether Prisms, and if 6 walls are allowed to stack up in front of the crystal, it will connect it to the boss, causing Fractillus to gain 200% increased damage and trigger Enrage Shattering, wiping your raid. The main aim of this fight is to arrange where you place these walls with different mechanics to avoid connecting them to the boss. I'd recommend placing markers in each lane before the fight so that you can call one marker to be your safe lane and fill up the rest with walls. When you start the fight and frequently after, 4 players will be marked with Crystalline Shockwave. These players are targeted by a white arrow that follows them from the boss, and after a short delay, a Crystal Nexus wall is going to shoot out from the boss through the marked player and leave a wall in that lane that the player is stood in, gradually building walls towards the boss. Players targeted will want to use a defensive for the hit and stand in different lanes here to spread out where the walls are deposited, as to not stack them towards the boss. But in doing so, this will also avoid killing each other as these walls will apply a nasty 12-second dot to anyone it travels through that stacks from every single wall. For this reason, you'll want the rest of your raid to stack in the area we marked as safe earlier, as no walls should be sent down this lane. After these walls go out, the raid will likely need to move out from the active tank that will then be marked with Shockwave Slam. This deals very large physical damage that must be mitigated, but also sends out another crystalline shockwave, so all other players should be sure to move away from the active tank ready for this so that you don't receive the shockwave dot. Tanks should try and pre-position themselves in a lane with the least amount of Nexus walls to evenly fill up these lanes, and then they should taunt swap after this mechanic, as they will then receive a debuff increasing their damage taken from future shockwave slams by 500% for 55 seconds. After placing 9 walls, Fractillus will target several players with Shatter Shell. This inflicts heavy shadow damage over 8 seconds, and upon expiration the player will be rooted for 4 seconds. The boss will immediately follow with a shattering backhand on all of these rooted players, knocking them back for large shadow damage, so use a defensive here, but this knockback also breaks a wall in the lane behind them. Players will want to position themselves in front of the walls that are closest to the boss to prevent them from reaching him, and note that you can actually destroy multiple walls in a single lane, so if you want to destroy 2 walls in one lane, make sure 2 players are inside it with the Shatter Shell debuff ready for the backhand. Whenever a wall is broken, it will also trigger a Nexus Shrapnel, spawning multiple swirlies that all players must dodge. However, on Heroic, the 2nd and 5th wall placed in every lane will become Void Infused. When these walls are broken, it will afflict multiple players with a null consumption circle that deals ticking damage for the 6-second duration. Upon expiration, this will cause a null explosion that deals large damage to anyone within 10 yards, so these debuff players need to spread away from other players and use a defensive, but be careful with your positioning so that you don't get hit with incoming Nexus walls when the shockwaves are coming out. You'll only want to destroy one of these void walls during each Shatter Shell wall break, so that you do not overwhelm your raid with too many null consumption debuffs that can easily end in a wipe. Nexus-King Salhadaar is the penultimate boss in this raid. This is a 3-phase fight with 2 intermission phases, and you'll want to bloodlust during the 2nd intermission. Before starting this fight, you'll need to split your raid evenly into 2 groups and drop a marker on either side of the boss for each group to stack on. The boss starts the fight with Decree Oathbound. This deals huge raid-wide damage over the 6-second cast, and also applies 3 stacks of Oathbound that need to be removed before the end of this phase, or you will become mind controlled. To remove these stacks, you'll need to stack on your group's tank when they are targeted with Conquer. This deals huge physical damage to the tank, but also deals insane shadow damage that needs to be split by the active tank's group, soaking the hit. Getting struck will knock players up, but more importantly removes the stack of Oathbound, as well as increasing damage taken by future Conquers by 100% for 20 seconds, so you need to taunt swap between these casts to make sure both groups are hit. Salhadaar will also hit the active tank with a frontal vanquish during this random sequence tank buster. This tank should reposition to the side for this frontal to make sure that they are the only one hit, as this deals lethal physical and shadow damage that also knocks the tank back, and increases damage taken from future vanquishes by 100% for 20 seconds. So again, tanks need to taunt swap between each vanquish. The boss can start this sequence with either ability, so tanks just make sure that you are hit by both abilities only once, and you'll need to be quick with taunting before the same ability is recast, as you cannot taunt if the cast has already begun, and getting struck by the same ability within the same sequence will kill you. Basically, only the tank should soak the cones, and each group needs to soak the circle once. While fighting the king, his dragon will also target multiple players with Behead. This shreds the targeted player and anyone caught in the line for big cosmic damage, and then leaves a cosmic rip on the floor. These mock players should run out to the sides of the room to drop these claws, which also makes dodging easier. Be careful not to run out too far though, because the dragons around the edge of the encounter will knock you back for huge damage, so stay clear of them. During this time, the Void Wing will also sweep across the arena with multiple besiege beams that will quickly kill any players caught in them, so during this first phase just keep on your toes. After 3 tank buster sequences, everyone in the raid should be free of Oathbound stacks, and you will now enter phase 2. This can also begin at 50% health, and here the boss will summon the Void Wing for us to also fight that tanks will need to pick up. Make sure to stay out of the Void portal it is summoned from, but be prepared for the knockback, and this Coalesce Void Wing will be cast multiple times throughout this phase, so just don't get knocked into other mechanics. Upon entering phase 2, 4 players will be targeted with a huge Netherbreaker circle that deals large damage and leaves a rift at the detonation. These rifts need to be dropped on the outskirts of the arena, as when the frontal Dimension Breath is cast on the active tank, it will also spawn portals from these rifts that shoot out even more beams. All of these beams must be dodged, so placing these portals away from the group makes dodging much easier. It is imperative that the active tank is the only player to get hit by the Dimension Breath so that they can mitigate this lethal cosmic damage heavily, as a portion of the damage taken from this breath will be dealt to the whole raid. Use big mitigation here to reduce the raid-wide damage. During this second phase, tanks will also need to deal with the Void Wing's Cosmic Maw. This deals huge physical damage and leaves a 10-second Cosmic Dot that also increases damage taken from Dimension Breath by 100%. Tanks use mitigation for this mechanic and taunt swap after the cosmic maw goes out so that the other tank can eat the next breath. Healers will need to keep on top of the rot damage that pulses every 2 seconds during the second phase, and then halfway through phase 2 the boss will enter its first intermission. Here we'll split back into our 2 groups, and each group should run to their designated portal on each side of the encounter and then use their extra action button to teleport over to the platforms where we'll find 3 different mobs. Tanks will need to immediately gain aggro on all of these enemies. Manaforge Titans must be focused down here before they reach 100 energy and self-destruct. This 10-second cast will detonate for fatal damage and wipe your raid, so make sure that this mob is dead before this cast goes off. The Titan will also fire dread mortars across the platform. These swirlies must be dodged. The Nexus Prince will need to be kicked on their Nether Blast. This nukes a player with lethal shadow damage, so do not let this go off. They will also charge up a Nexus Beam that spawns 3 rotating beams that players must avoid and rotate with. The last mobs here are Shadow Guard Reapers. They will teleport to a random player and reap them for big shadow damage, which leaves an 8-second dot. Use the defensive if you get low, but healers should be able to keep on top of the outgoing damage here. Once all of these adds are defeated, you'll head back to the main platform to continue with phase 2. After a short while, we then will enter the second intermission. Here the boss will begin channeling King's Hunger, where he will drain the energy of the Voidwing, increasing its damage taken by 100% for 30 seconds, while also pulsing AoE damage to the raid. Here is where you'll want to pop Bloodlust in your offensive cooldowns to burn the Voidwing down as much as you can with the damage amp, because upon finishing his cast, Salhadaar will heal himself equal to the dragon's remaining health and enter the final phase. During this last phase, a ring will spawn on the outside of the platform that slowly contracts, killing anyone that touches it very quickly, so this last phase is the DPS race. At the beginning of this phase, the king will split himself into 3 different clones and begin casting Galactic Smash at 3 targeted players. Upon completion, each clone will leap at a targeted player, slamming the raid for massive cosmic damage and applying a nasty 8-second dot to the target that you'll want to pop a defensive for. These players will want to run to the edges of the encounter because this smash will also leave a dark star at the impact location that then draws in all players while repeatedly creating large rings that expand outwards and explode a few seconds later. Players must continue to dodge all of these rings while running out from the pull-in, and on Heroic these rings will rotate around the platform as they expand. While these stars are erupting, the boss will target multiple players with Star Killer swings that need to be aimed at these dark stars to explode them to free up space. The active tank will be star shattered by this Star Killer swing, dealing much larger physical damage that must be mitigated, and also increasing damage taken from star shattered by 100% for 40 seconds, so tanks should swap after each Star Killer swing. While there is one final boss in the raid, Dimensius, we haven't been able to test this fight on the PTR, so I'll be making a separate detailed guide just for the last boss. But that is it for the Manaforge Omega raid, so if this guide did help you out then please feel free to drop a like down below, subscribe to your boy, and until next time I'll catch you guys later.